What happens when two police officers steal money from an elderly black woman, thinking no one would fight back? No headlines, no outrage. Just a quiet woman, sitting alone at her kitchen table, trying to figure out how to afford surgery after everything was taken. But what those officers didn't know was this. Her son wasn't just any man. He was a Green Beret, trained in silence, focused like a blade. And when he came home, he didn't come to make noise. He came to dismantle a system. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about precision, restraint, and what happens when someone finally says, enough. Let me take you into the heart of Atlanta, where one man didn't raise his voice, but made the whole city listen. Margaret Davis didn't cry when they took her money. She didn't scream or plead or even ask why. She simply stood there, small, tired, and invisible, as two uniformed officers walked out of the bank with her life savings sealed in an evidence bag. No arrest, no charges. Just a vague claim of ongoing investigation and a signed receipt that meant nothing. The teller had looked away. The manager had apologized softly, but no one stopped them. Not one person spoke up. Margaret had taught in this neighborhood for 42 years. She'd helped raise generations of children who now ran its shops, wrote for its papers, and patrolled its streets. Yet in that moment, none of it seemed to matter. Not her good name, not her age, not even the reason she withdrew the money to pay for a surgery her insurance wouldn't fully cover. That night, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with her hands clasped and her lips pressed shut. The house was quiet except for the slow tick of the clock above the stove. She stared at the phone, not because she was afraid, but because she knew what would happen once she made the call. Her son hadn't been home in 4 years, not since his last deployment. He had always told her not to worry, not to call unless it was something she couldn't handle on her own. It wasn't pride that kept her silent this long. It was trust, that somehow the system would make things right without needing to wake up someone trained for war. But tonight, the silence had gone too far. And so Margaret Davis picked up the phone, dialed the overseas number with fingers that trembled more from shame than age, and waited. The voice that answered wasn't groggy. It wasn't distracted or delayed. "Mom?" came the reply, firm and alert. "What happened?" She paused. Her throat clenched. Then she whispered, "They took everything, Samuel." For a moment, there was nothing on the line but breath. Then, quietly, the tone of a soldier took over. "I'm coming home." And that was the moment everything began to shift. Not just for Margaret, not just for Samuel, but for an entire precinct that thought no one would ever push back. Samuel Davis didn't pack much. Just a carry-on and the jacket he never stopped wearing. The ride from the airport to his mother's house was silent. No music, no distractions. His eyes scanned the streets not like a man coming home, but like someone studying terrain. The corners he grew up around had changed. New storefronts, brighter lights, but the same uneasy quiet beneath it all. When he stepped through the front door, Margaret didn't greet him with tears. She just nodded once, slowly, and motioned to the folder sitting on the kitchen table. Inside were her bank statements, a copy of the withdrawal slip, and a blurry photo of the officers who'd taken the money, printed off from a neighbor's security camera. Samuel flipped through the pages without speaking. His face didn't show anger, just calculation. He didn't go to the precinct that night. Instead, he sat down with a yellow legal pad and began to map out names, dates, and relationships. The officers involved were part of Zone 3 PD, a division with a long reputation for aggressive enforcement, especially in Black and Latino neighborhoods. Officer Brent Holloway was the name on the receipt. Samuel underlined it 3 times. In the days that followed, he made quiet visits, first to the records office at City Hall, then to a retired judge who owed his mother a favor, then to a local journalist he'd gone to high school with. Bit by bit, a picture emerged. Holloway had been investigated before. Use of force complaints, unlawful seizures, racial profiling, but each case either disappeared into internal review or was buried in bureaucracy. The most disturbing part wasn't what Samuel found, it was how easily he found it. The old rules of engagement still applied: observe, assess, isolate, neutralize. But this wasn't a battlefield, this was home. And Samuel understood something the officers didn't. He didn't need to break the system. He only needed to show how broken it already was. For people like Margaret, justice had always come too late. if it came at all. But for the first time in years, she saw her son not as the boy she raised or the man who served overseas, but as someone who understood how power worked and how to dismantle it without raising his voice. The next morning, he walked up the steps of Zone 3 PD, not with a lawyer, not with press, but with a folder under one arm and a calm that unnerved the front desk clerk more than a threat ever could. And behind that calm, a quiet promise had already formed. He wasn't leaving until something changed. Officer Brent Holloway wasn't sloppy. That was the problem. His reports were always clean. His body cam footage often malfunctioned. His arrests ticked every legal box on paper. But Samuel Davis had seen this kind of precision before. In combat, it was called operational discipline. In policing, it became something more dangerous, the ability to hide cruelty behind procedure. Samuel didn't look for dramatic scandals. He searched for patterns. Over a 10-year span, Holloway had filed 74 property seizure reports. 49 involved citizens over the age of 60. 42 involved Black or Latino residents. Only 6 resulted in formal charges. None went to trial. Most were never followed up. Each case had a reason, a technicality, a warrant mix-up, or suspicions of fraud that never materialized. On their own, they looked random. Together, they told a story. He built a timeline, cross-referenced badge numbers, highlighted repeating names. Several other officers had ties to Holloway's cases, including a now-promoted supervisor who'd closed internal investigations before they reached civilian review. These weren't bad apples. This was a quietly managed pipeline, one that targeted the vulnerable under the shield of legitimacy. Samuel printed out each case summary and spread them across the floor of his mother's guest room. Margaret stood at the doorway, silent, watching her son kneel among the papers like a man setting up camp. "How deep does it go?" she asked. He didn't answer right away, just circled another name and added it to the board. Then he looked up. They thought no one would put the pieces together, because the victims didn't have lawyers, didn't have noise, just silence. And that was the cruelest part. Not the thefts, not the threats, but the assumption that silence meant surrender. Samuel knew better. He'd seen entire villages erased because no one with power cared to look. He'd also seen what happened when someone finally did. That evening, he filed a quiet request through a back channel, asking for the internal affairs documents related to Holloway. He knew it wouldn't come easily, but he wasn't asking for permission. He was documenting resistance, because sometimes the only way to expose a system is to make it show its own face. When Officer Brent Holloway invited Samuel Davis to the precinct, he didn't do it with hostility. He didn't issue a subpoena or send a warning. He offered coffee, a conversation. "Let's clear the air," he said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Samuel accepted, not because he trusted him, but because he wanted to see the trap up close. The precinct break room was too clean. One chair, pulled slightly forward. A second security camera placed discreetly above the corner vent, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. Holloway had chosen the spot carefully, the kind of place where an emotional outburst could be framed as aggression, where a single raised voice could justify a narrative. He sat across from Samuel with his arms loose, voice easy. "Your mom's been through a lot. Unfortunate situation, but rules are rules, right?" Samuel didn't respond. He watched the way Holloway leaned back, just enough to look relaxed but not enough to be vulnerable. The way he tapped the table twice before sipping, repeating a rhythm, controlling the room. This wasn't a man nervous about being caught. This was a man who had practiced his lines. Holloway kept talking, slipped in comments about how people don't always understand protocol, how some folks overreact, how veterans sometimes struggle with transitions back into civilian life. The bait wasn't crude, it was strategic, designed to chip at Samuel's composure, word by word. But Samuel had faced worse than this. He'd been interrogated by enemies who didn't speak his language, watched friends bleed out in sandstorms, survived nights with only instinct to keep him alive. This rune, this man, he wasn't a threat. He was a test. So he didn't flinch. He didn't answer. He simply slid a single sheet of paper across the table, an excerpt from one of Holloway's old use-of-force reports, one that didn't match the body cam time code, one that had quietly disappeared from the official archive until Samuel pulled it from a local backup. "Looks like your camera didn't fail that day," Samuel said calmly. It was never turned on. Holloway's smile flickered, not fully gone, just cracked. He folded the paper without reading it, then stood. "You're not in a war zone anymore," he said, voice sharper now. "No," Samuel replied, standing too. "I'm somewhere worse, a place that thinks it's at peace." He left without another word. Behind him, Holloway stood still, fingers clenched behind his back. And outside the station, Samuel didn't take a breath of relief. He took out his notebook and drew a single line across the page. Contact made. Psychological tactics confirmed. Escalation likely. Because now the game wasn't hidden anymore. It had a face, a voice, a schedule, and Samuel was ready to make his next move. Not every officer at Zone 3 wore their silence comfortably. Some carried it like a weight they couldn't put down. Lieutenant Curtis Monroe was one of them. He'd served nearly 30 years, long enough to know the patterns, but also long enough to know what happened to those who questioned them. He had watched colleagues rise not because they protected the public, but because they protected the unspoken rules. And Holloway? He didn't just play by those rules. He wrote them in invisible ink. Curtis wasn't a hero. He wasn't looking to become one. But when he saw Samuel Davis sitting alone on the precinct steps at dusk, flipping through a folder like a man counting the hours before something fell apart, he knew he couldn't stay quiet much longer. He waited until the parking lot cleared, then approached slowly. No uniform, just an old windbreaker and a cup of gas station coffee. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. Samuel didn't look up. "If you've come to warn me off, save it. I already know they're watching me." Curtis shook his head. "I came because I've been watching too, and I've got a feeling you're not leaving the city until something cracks." Samuel finally looked at him, not with suspicion, but with the tired recognition of someone who spent years hoping at least one person inside the system still had a conscience. Curtis didn't waste time. He spoke in low, clipped tones, told him what most people suspected but could never prove, that Holloway's file had been scrubbed twice in the past decade, that internal affairs only touched what the brass allowed, that the recent surge in asset seizures had been quietly encouraged to help boost department revenues. And most chilling of all, that Holloway wasn't acting alone. "There's a shield behind the badge," Curtis said. "Not the one we wear, the one no one sees. Political, financial, protected. You go after Holloway, that shield turns on you, and fast." Samuel didn't blink. "Then I'll move faster." But Curtis wasn't finished. He leaned in, voice firm but trembling at the edges. "Listen to me. They've put out feelers. There's talk of outside help, not legal, not procedural, the kind of help that doesn't knock. You're not just digging into policy anymore. You're threatening their structure." Samuel nodded once. "Good. That means they're scared." Curtis placed a slip of paper in his hand. "A name, an address. If anything happens to me, start there." Then he stood and walked away without waiting for a response. And as Samuel sat alone under the streetlight, the air around him felt colder. Not because of fear, but because the line had been crossed. This wasn't about stolen money anymore. It was about who gets to write the rules and who has the courage to erase them. They came at night. 3 men, no badges, no hesitation. Their steps were fast, but not rushed. They knew the layout of the street. They knew when the porch light went off. They even knew the corner of the backyard where the fence sagged, just enough for a man to slip through without making a sound. What they didn't know was that Samuel Davis had already mapped the same terrain. He had counted the footsteps from the alley to the kitchen window. He had studied the neighbor's dog's barking pattern. And more importantly, he had known, from the moment Lieutenant Monroe handed him that slip of paper, that something was coming. The first man dropped before he reached the back door. A wire across the narrow walkway caught him low. He didn't even get a chance to shout. The second froze when the porch light flicked on by itself, motion triggered from a device Samuel had installed just hours earlier. The third turned to run, but a figure moved from the shadows of the hedge, silent and fast. By the time he hit the ground, his weapon was already in Samuel's hands. No shots fired, no sirens, just the echo of quick breath and the metallic snap of zip ties. Samuel didn't ask questions. He didn't need names. He left only one message, carved with a blade into the front door of the lead attacker's truck. "I know who sent you." The next morning, nothing appeared in the news. No police report, no signs of disturbance. But in the quiet corners of Zone 3, the message spread. Holloway heard it from a sergeant's whisper. Monroe saw it in the shift of posture among junior officers. People began to hesitate, to pause before signing off on the usual paperwork, to wonder who else was watching. Margaret didn't know the details. She only noticed that Samuel drank his coffee a little slower the next morning, his hands steady, his eyes still. "Did they come?" she asked. He nodded once. "Did they leave?" "They did." And that was enough, because for the first time in a long time, the silence wasn't on Margaret's side of the city, it was on theirs. The kind of silence that follows when power gets frightened and starts listening. Brent Holloway didn't expect to be cornered. Not here, not like this. He had always believed in the strength of routine, that as long as you kept your shirt pressed, your tone calm, and your records carefully edited, nothing would ever touch you. That belief began to crack the moment he walked into the station garage and found Samuel Davis waiting beside his patrol car, alone, unarmed, and silent. No threat, just presence. And in that presence, a weight Holloway couldn't laugh off. Before he could speak, Samuel raised a small recorder. Click. The red light blinked once. "We're off the books now," he said. Holloway glanced at the nearby security camera. It was unplugged. He hadn't even noticed. "What do you want?" Holloway asked, his voice tight. Samuel didn't answer. He opened a folder. Inside, copies of complaint files, deposition notes, missing body cam timestamps, and 3 affidavits from former officers willing to talk, if needed. At the top was a photo, not of Holloway, but of the 3 men who had tried to enter Margaret's home. 2 of their faces were visible. One had an ID badge tucked into his boot. Samuel slid the photo forward. "You hired them," he said flatly. "You used public money to arrange private violence. That's attempted murder, abuse of power, and conspiracy." Holloway laughed, a shallow, brittle sound. "You think anyone's going to believe you?" Samuel turned the page. There it was, a wire transfer receipt from an account tied to a city fund, redirected through a vendor contract, then funneled to a shell agency. "You're not just a bad cop," Samuel said. "You're sloppy." Something shifted in Holloway then. Not fear, not guilt. Just exhaustion, the kind that settles in when the walls finally start to close and you realize no one's coming to dig you out. He sat down, hands open. Voice low. "They told me it would never touch me, that I was protected, that people like her didn't matter." Samuel didn't flinch. "Say it again." "They said Margaret Davis didn't matter," Holloway whispered, "that no one would care." The recorder blinked steadily. No emotion, just the quiet collection of truth. By the end of the hour, Holloway had confessed to 6 coordinated seizures, 3 falsified arrest reports, and the attempted elimination of Samuel. He named 2 ranking officials who had signed off, gave dates, methods, payouts. When Samuel stood to leave, Holloway reached for one last thread. "This won't fix it. They'll just find someone else." Samuel turned back. "Maybe, but next time they'll remember your name and what it cost to protect it." That night, the video was sent to 4 people. An investigative journalist, a civil rights attorney, Lieutenant Curtis Monroe, and Margaret Davis. By dawn, it was everywhere. By noon, the video had reached every hallway in City Hall, every inbox in the local press, and every phone of every officer still working the day shift at Zone 3. It wasn't dramatic, just Holloway, under a flickering fluorescent light, his voice low, stripped of swagger. There were no gunshots, no confrontation. Just the steady drip of truth landing harder than any blow. The department issued a brief statement. Pending investigation, but no one believed it. Not anymore. Within hours, Brent Holloway was gone, not arrested, not relocated, just vanished. His home was empty, his phone disconnected, and in his absence, something else began to unravel. Officers who once strutted now watched their backs. Internal emails stopped mid-thread. Commanders held meetings behind closed doors, but their voices carried further than they realized. In the locker rooms, conversations shifted from defense to doubt. Some left early, some called in sick, and some, like Officer Damon O'Reilly, began to unravel from the inside. O'Reilly had been there the day Margaret's money was taken. He hadn't laid hands on her, but he'd stood by, saying nothing, his thumb hovering near his belt clip as she tried to explain through tears. He told himself it wasn't his decision, that he was just following procedure. But now, every quiet shift felt louder. Every glance from a passerby felt heavier. He started avoiding eye contact, took his lunch breaks in his car, flinched at the sound of every ringtone. Once, a neighborhood kid rode by on a bike and said, "You on the video too?" O'Reilly didn't answer. He just sat in the dark for 20 minutes before driving home. Meanwhile, at the precinct, a new kind of silence began to settle. Not the silence of cover-ups or complicity, but the kind that follows reckoning. That lingers in the corners of a place where something sacred was finally broken, and where people have to decide what to rebuild from the pieces. Margaret Davis watched it unfold quietly from her porch. She didn't gloat, she didn't smile, she just watched. And inside, Samuel was already packing, not to leave in defeat, but because his job was never to stay. It was to remind those who had forgotten. Silence is not absence. It is a space waiting to be filled with accountability. And this time it was. The hospital room was quiet, but not in that sterile way most of them are. There was sunlight coming through the blinds, warming the side of the bed where Margaret Davis sat upright, her shoulders draped in a shawl Samuel had brought from overseas. The surgery had gone well. The doctors said she would be walking again in a week. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the way she looked at her son. Like someone seeing not just the man he had become, but the boy she raised to believe in right and wrong, even when the lines got blurred. Samuel sat beside her without speaking. His eyes were calm now. The weight in his jaw had softened. He didn't wear a badge or a uniform. He didn't need to. He had done what needed doing and left the noise behind. Margaret reached for his hand. It wasn't the kind of gesture meant for comfort. It was something quieter. A small, firm grip. The kind that says, "I see you. I believe you. And I'm still here." Neither of them brought up Holloway, or the department, or the video that had now crossed state lines, sparking internal audits in 3 precincts and prompting calls from advocacy groups asking Samuel to speak. He'd said no to all of them. Because the fight wasn't the point. It never had been. It was about reminding people, like Margaret, like Curtis Monroe, like every viewer who'd sat in silence too long, that justice doesn't always come with flashing lights or courtroom applause. Sometimes it arrives with quiet eyes and a single decision made at the right time. As the nurse stepped in to check Margaret's vitals, Samuel rose. He walked over to the window and looked out, not like a man planning what came next, but like someone finally able to stand still. And in that stillness, something had changed. Not the world, not the system, but the balance. Because somewhere in Atlanta, a precinct was learning to move more carefully. Somewhere, an officer was rereading the rule book, not out of fear, but reflection. And somewhere, another mother might be spared from calling her child not out of pride, but because this time someone in uniform chose not to look away. If you've ever felt powerless in the face of authority, press 1. If you still believe quiet integrity can win, press 2. This story wasn't loud. It didn't need to be, because truth doesn't shout, it waits, and when spoken at the right moment, it echoes. And if stories like this matter to you, stay with us. Subscribe for more voices that won't be silenced, and moments that remind us. Justice, when it comes, is never too late.